Welcome back. Wednesday, June 16th, 2021. The President of the United States came back from meeting with the Russian leader at their first summit and said, quote, "He just beat the hell out of me," close quote. That was John Kennedy in 1961, speaking of his summit with Nikita Khrushchev. Quote, "He savaged me, worst thing in my life," close quote. What happened? Kennedy simply thought he could charm and outthink Khrushchev, and he was unprepared for Khrushchev's coldness or callousness towards life. I'm watching the summit in Geneva between Biden and Putin, and though the reasons are a little different, even if related, there's going to have to be a major turnaround for the narrative to be much different than 1961 in the end. If ever strong and weak horses mattered, they matter when it comes to U.S.-Soviet or U.S.-Russian relations. Jimmy Carter would plant a kiss physically on the cheek of Leonid Brezhnev, and the Soviets ramped up their invasions and abuse of the West, including Afghanistan. Ronald Reagan refused to even meet with the Soviets at any point in his first term, and the USSR reformed and fell. The memory holding has already begun on this one. Before the summit has even concluded, former CIA Director John Brennan said this on CNN yesterday, quote, "Unlike a Trump who was a novice, an amateur, and he stumbled through the issues, Biden is deeply educated on these issues, and he can talk about them in a way that Donald Trump never could." I will give you another hearing of that. John Brennan, former director of the CIA. "Unlike a Trump who was a novice, an amateur, and he stumbled through the issues, Biden is deeply educated on these issues, and he can talk about them in a way that Donald Trump never could." We found an example of Joe Biden doing just this in Geneva.
In a weekend interview, Vladimir Putin laughed at the suggestion that you had called him a killer. Is that still your belief, sir, that he is a killer? And I'll continue the trend if you don't mind about question. Do you believe if he does agree to cooperate, then what kind of challenges do you find yourself? How would you ever trust him? And if Ronald Reagan said trust but verify, what do you say to Vladimir Putin?
Answer the first question. I'm laughing too. They actually.
No one was laughing.
Well, look. I mean, he has made clear that.
You haven't lost power on your radio.
The answer is, I believe he's in the past essentially acknowledged that he was. There are certain things that he would do or did do. But look. When I was asked that question on air, I answered it honestly. But it's not much of a. I don't think it matters a whole lot in terms of this.
That's his answer is about an answer he previously. I've already answered that question once, honestly, about the thing that he used to do. What was that? 6 seconds of silence. Can you get to the beginning of his answer again, not the question, Bill? How hard would that be? I know we're in the monologue. Is it still possible to do? Right where Joe Biden starts answering the question with a laugh?
And if Ronald
Is that possible?
Reagan said trust but verify.
Just about there.
Answer the first question. I'm laughing too. They actually. Well, look. I mean, he has made clear that.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
The answer is, I believe he's in the past.
Well, as John Brennan said, unlike a Trump who was a novice, an amateur, and he stumbled through the issues, Biden is deeply educated on these issues, and he can talk about them in a way that Donald Trump never could. At least Joe Biden doesn't stumble through the issues like Donald Trump, huh? And who saw coming that Vladimir Putin would turn the January 6th attack on the Capitol around on Joe Biden and the Democrats, making a political crime the crime of the shooting of Ashley Babbitt and the cover-up being on Biden, not Trump? I don't know if that will resonate, but it shouldn't be forgotten. In one sentence, Vladimir Putin put the moral and political ugliness of January 6th on Biden and the Democrats and stole it as the battering ram the Democrats had turned it into and using it against conservatives. See, that's the thing. If you act like an authoritarian and what happened with Ashley Babbitt is nothing but the mark of authoritarianism, do not be surprised to be called one. And even if by another authoritarian. But that is the point, isn't it? Moral equivalence. Our problem is not calling authoritarians out. It's not calling them out here or elsewhere. And it's also our problem that the word has nearly been rendered meaningless by its being tossed around too casually when it should not be used. Moral equivalence being gained at the expense of moral distinctions between good and evil are now lost. And that was always our foreign policy concern. That moral distinctions between good and evil would not be lost. At least we stated that. Whereby it used to matter here when our leaders acted or embraced policies or positions or tactics of our enemies, or at least policies, positions, and tactics that were not democratic. Thus, Tucker Carlson is absolutely right to ask, as he did, who did shoot Ashley Babbitt and why don't we know? Are anonymous agents now allowed to kill unarmed women who protest the regime? That's okay now? No, it's not, and it never will be. And why are all those January 6 protesters still in prison on trespassing charges as so many Biden voters who torched federal buildings are walking free? What's the answer to that question? If all that was going on in Russia, we would call it scary. We would call Putin a dictator. Right. But it's going on here, which should be scary here, since fire burns in Athens as it burns in Rome, so too does fear. This is a major problem for the left at several integral philosophical levels. Really big one. When you round up and hold indefinitely your own citizens for political purposes, which is what we're doing by the hundreds, what word does work or have meaning anymore? And why shouldn't our enemies use it against us when we raise our concerns about their behavior with them? If we act like them, they're right to tell us we are no better. And that's the other concern, because we are. This is the major problem the left has foisted upon us and used to a fare thee well. Let me try to break these issues down. 1, the left preens about human rights abuses. 2, if the human rights abuse comes from a leftist regime or an anti-American regime, it will be ignored or covered up or given subvention. China, Iran. 3, the left does not believe America is exceptional, great, or better than any other place. So 4, thus it has no problem reducing and stinting our banner, emblems, and marquees of such greatness, our liberties, our freedom. 5, thus it has no problem comparing us and our allies to the worst regimes in modern times. See Ilhan Omar comparing the U.S. and Israel to the Taliban and Hamas. This is how moral equivalence begins. And distinctions lose their meaning. We've spoken about distinctions a lot recently and how important they are, be they ideological, partisan, ethical, religious, human, God, animal. In essence, scientific. In essence, we are talking about things like God as opposed to man, man as opposed to animal. We're talking nature or natural law, if you prefer, the principles we were founded on. Because once those distinctions, laws of nature and nature's God, because once those distinctions are secure, as opposed to, say, distinctions based on blood and who your father was, you can then make the subsidiary distinctions about good and bad, liberty and tyranny. Once you are in compliance with the natural law, nature, common sense, and the distinctions they present you, you are prepared, and only then prepared, to begin the discussions of distinctions on right and wrong, and good and bad, and liberty versus tyranny. Does one policy, for instance, serve the freedom and flourishing of man, or does it disserve it? Does one policy, for instance, confuse the distinctions between God and man, allowing men to act like gods, or does it preserve the distinction, forbidding such arrogations? Does one policy, for instance, confuse the distinction between man and animal, such that certain men could be treated like certain animals? I hope one sees the classic problem of philosophy here, that is, the need for distinctions, contrasts, common meanings. When those distinctions are intact, men do not treat other men like animals or act like gods. In other words, when natural distinctions are preserved and protected, people and liberty thrive. When natural distinctions are voided or confused, we end up with examples of the worst regimes and crimes in history, assuming we can still understand what the word worst means in comparison to good or better or best or great, making it all the more ironic. Ilhan Omar attributes the word crimes against humanity, which comes from a very certain trial in 1946, to the United States and Israel. If the left today hates two things, it's America and distinctions. And I suppose it is part and parcel of the same thing, because it is only via distinction that America and even the West can be seen as great philosophical and cultural pioneers, the straight stick, if you will, laid next to the crooked ones. This rings hollow with the left because their Marxist inclinations and beliefs teach and instructs them that the only distinctions that matter are based on class and race, not between animal and man or man and God, but between different classes of humans based on race and economics, which of course take the old categories of hierarchy, putting the disfavored race or class into the position of animal and the favored class into the position of gods or tyrants who can act like gods, missing the main point and distinction and class, which is human. Abraham Lincoln put it that we can repeal the Declaration of Independence, we can repeal all past history, but you cannot repeal human nature. He said, but I give you the left today. They are repealing not only the first two, history and the Declaration of Independence, they're trying awfully hard at the third, human nature. They may not be able to physically, truly do it. They aren't God, but they sure as heck can engage in policies and rhetoric among the populace that has the effect of repealing human nature, giving us the dystopia that would result if it were done. That happens, and even the insignificant and personal distinctions like intelligence, beauty, strength, they all disappear. Which is why I have you read Kurt Vonnegut's story, Harrison Bergeron, as often as I can. There was a lot here. Let me just say, it's good to be back, and thanks to J.D. Hayworth and Robert Graham for stepping in the past few days. Really appreciate it. Bill, your double duty. Thank you very much, and you all for your patience. But my fear here on this monologue, I hope we are not commencing an era that we already went through in our long twilight struggle. But then again, to know about that twilight struggle, one would have to know the difference between the distinction, if I may, between day and night. A distinction the left has also tried to extinguish. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.